Okay, so now we have a good color base, good AO map, a good diffuse map. Now we need to go in and start making it look sexy. Specular maps are what I call the sex maps. They make things look shiny and great because when light reflects off a surface and it's a little bit more reflective like metal, the light focuses on places like the edges of a model, okay? Or the edges of these inlet places. Light just seems to gather and congregate around these sharp little recessed edges. Also around the outset maps as well. So what we can do is we can selectively pick what parts of our normal map we're going to have shiny. Basically, I'm just going to see if I can get away with doing just a all-inclusive spec map. We'll play around with that, see if it works. If not, we can always go in and tweak it. So what I'm going to do is, let me go ahead and save out my map. It's a good time to save. Good reminder for everybody. I'm going to go in now and take this normal map here and duplicate the whole group into another document. Alright, I'm not going to go ahead and just collapse it. I'm actually going to come in and hide the damage texture. I don't want spec maps really on my damage texture because it's burnt up, it's got carbon scoring. It's not going to be reflective. That soot and ash is going to keep it from being too reflective. So I'm just going to take all the sharp edge detail I've created, and now I'm going to collapse it. Alright, so let's go back to Undo. And much like the same way we made our ambient occlusion map, we're going to go down to the Convert button down here. And instead of picking AO map, we're going to pick Specular map and active dock. So we're going to let Undo do its thing. Also, keep in mind about spec maps, it's nice to have a little bit of color in your spec maps. So when the light reflects off, it's just not reflecting yellow or white. Sometimes it's good to have it reflect yellow. It's all depending on what type of material you have. So for this rusty, metally thing in space, I think a nice greenish yellow tint to our spec map will serve its purposes nicely. We'll see that after Undo gets done, it's going to create these nice focused beams of light on our model here. So this right here is not our spec map. Undo needs to create a displacement map, and then it uses the displacement map to create the specular. So we can even use this displacement map to add a little bit of oomph to our diffuse map. So, we'll see how it works out for us. So just give it a little bit more time to create the specular map. Let's see. And also for our damage, I mentioned earlier that we don't want too much reflectivity coming off of our spec map. So we're actually going to take our damage texture mask and we're going to go in and we're just going to block out the light from our spec map. Alright. Spec maps work like this. The brighter the color here, now there's our spec map right there. So let's take a second and just look at it and see what's going on. The lighter places are going to reflect more light. And Undo does an amazing job of just picking the edges of our material that we have here to reflect the light off of. Remember, as I said, light congregates on those edges. Look how nice and bright our edges are off of that spec map. And it also does a good job of going into our crevices here and picking a good place for the spec map to get a little bit darker. Alright, so here's our end spec map. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to transport this whole map straight to my original document. I'm not going to try to cut out anything with my mask. I'm just going to flatten it all and transfer. So we'll flatten it. That gets rid of some of the information. Here's a little thing about Undo. With the workflow I've created about flattening, when you flatten it, it kind of messes with some of the color information. It doesn't give you the original approximation. Alright, so I gotta go in and I'll usually like flattening things in bits and pieces sometimes just to make sure that Endo doesn't do anything crazy, or Photoshop doesn't do anything crazy with my original specular map. Alright, so let's go back to our original, and now we finally get to go into our specular zone right here. So I'm going to select base right here, and when I transfer over my specular map, so I'll duplicate layer, set my destination to my original document, and hit OK. So now I can go in, and now I have my specular map rocking and rolling. And we'll call this specular base. Okay. I also want to go back to that displacement map and see if I can't use it to add a little bit of extra depth and feel for our diffuse map. That might be a nice little addition there. So I'm just going to flatten all these layers, and let's call this Diffuse Overlay. And I'm going to go back to our original document and go back into my color here, and I'm just going to put it on top of everything here. So diffuse, there we go. There's a diffuse. Oh, the displacement map is actually what we're going to be dealing with. But I like the displacement map because it has a little bit of color variation and value shifts on just the flat surfaces of my model, just to give it a little bit more value variation. And we'll see how that works out for us. And let's do a multiply for that. Alright. And we'll add my ambient occlusion in. So this is without the diffuse overlay I just made. This is with it. It's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to go in and brighten it a little bit. I don't want to use levels. I want to just straight up brighten it. Maybe up the contrast a little bit so we get more of that detail, that little variation. Alright, cool. I just think it adds a little bit more of a visual impact with having a little bit of surface variation going on here. And I'm actually going to go to my mask, go to my UV islands here, select my base mask there, and I'm going to go in and just delete the excess diffuse overlay that I'm not going to be working with, just so I can see the contrast between my very base color and what we're actually working with here. Alright, so that's without it. This is with it. Without it, with it. Maybe I'll lower my opacity down just a little bit. There we go. Cool. Alright, so now I'm going to go down to my specular and see what we can do with it. Alright, so here's my specular, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer and call this specular overlay color. Overlay color. And remember I said I want to give it kind of a yellowish green tint. I'm just going to plaster that over there and do a overlay. Alright, that's a little bit too much. I guarantee if we put this on there, it's going to look crazy. So let's just go ahead and see what that looks like, and we'll see how changing up my specular map affects my model. So mass save to the rescue. See, it's starting to chug a little bit the more layers you add. That's why I like working with Endo outside of the original document, because the more layers and stuff you have, the slower Photoshop starts chugging. Alright, so there's my displacement map it made. And, you know, here's a diffuse map. We can maybe add that in if you wanted, if we want, just to give those shadows and nooks and crannies a little bit more of that oomph we want. So let's go ahead and flatten my diffuse before we close it out. And let's bring it over to my color map too. We'll put it right underneath my diffuse overlay. And we're just using every bit of resources that Endo gives us to tweak and accentuate our original diffuse map. Alright, so now we have our diffuse in. Let's take a look at what it does. Let's give it a multiply. Right now it just makes everything darker. Let's get rid of the excess that we want, and we'll do this, lower the opacity, and I'm going to brighten it up a little bit and give it a little bit more contrast. As we can see, we're getting more color depth information on our original diffuse map. So we'll call this displacement overlay, because remember that was our original displacement map, and we'll call this diffuse overlay. And without them, we're stuck with this. If we add them, now we're getting a lot more color information, and it just feels like it brings the depth out into our original color map we have working on. Alright, so we did our mask save. Let's do another one because I added that diffuse map in. Just going through all the steps. So let's check our marmoset now. And immediately I like the color depth we have going on here. It just adds a little bit more oomph, like I said. So we have our specular map loaded in, but we're not getting specular color. Let me get the light rotating. Alright, I want to get a nice fast rotation of my light, and we'll really be able to see our specks pop. But they're not activated yet, even though we have the map loaded. I'm going to have to go and use Specularity. Ooh, remember how yellow it was? This is the result of that. Alright, so let's slow down my rotation a little bit and see what's happening with my model now. Well, obviously everything's yellow now. It's not a very good effect. But more importantly, if we look around the edges of all my normal map detail, they're starting to catch the light a lot. So it's not as dark. It comes back around and rotates. Now it's getting brighter. So that's really nice. I don't really like to mess with these settings too much because I like my specular map just to be as default as possible. That way when you take it into a game engine, all the tweaks you did in Marmoset, they won't transfer over. So all the tweaks you did in Marmoset to get your specular map looking good won't transfer over to another program. So let's just kind of leave our specular settings alone as much as possible, and let's just do most of our tweaks inside of Photoshop for it. Alright, so what I want to do now is I want to come in here and I want to desaturate my overlay color. Alright, well, let's take a look at what it does without the overlay color as well. So let's do another mask save. We'll get all of our maps loaded up, and we can go into Marmoset and we can see the difference now. Well, immediately it's not yellow anymore, but the colors are still washed out. Alright, so this is without it, this is with it. See how the specular also just washes out all the flat color information? We're still getting these nice pops and highlights around our edges, and it's starting to look a little bit more metal, but we're not really getting, we're losing a lot of color information because our specular map is washing out all of our flat color. Alright, so let's go back into Photoshop and see if we can't fix the original base. Let me go back in and hide all these layers here. So sometimes what I like doing is I like to go to my specular base and I like to increase my contrast and lower the darkness of it. So what this is doing is it's taking all of my white highlights here and it's bumping them up, while at the same time it's going to my flat surface area right here and it's pulling it down. Alright, and don't be afraid to go ahead and maybe subtract, go really dark with it. Even though our edges are getting a little bit darker too, trust me, they'll still show up. I mean, there could be such a thing as having too much highlight around our edges, making it look too shiny. So that's our specular base toned down a bit. Let's just see how that looks now. Save it out. Alright, so now we have more of our original color information, and as our light goes around, we're still picking up highlights around our edges. Alright, so let's go in and see if we can't see it around our damage. Yeah, it's there. Let me increase the rotation speed of my light source just so we can see the normals and the specs working together. We're getting really nice highlights around the edges of my normal detail. That really helps keep the forms and the shapes popping. Sometimes it's easy to kind of miss the detail of our normal map because it gets drowned out by our diffuse and our ambient occlusion. Well, the spec map brings those normal details back to the forefront by, like I said, highlighting these edges around our detail. It's a really subtle effect, but when it comes all together, it makes your models look really nice. Alright, so now let's go in and add our overlay color for our spec map. This is way too yellow. So I can either lower the opacity, and see now I have a nice yellowish tint on all my highlights. And it might just come down to the fact that we're going to have to come in and delete all the specular information on my flat surfaces here, or at least delete the yellow tint on all my detailed information. So we can do that by, you guessed it, going back to our masks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a master mask. So I'm going to duplicate this, just a one layer mask that we can all duplicate down and collapse to really just zone in on my just the edges of the detail I want to get going with. Alright, so I don't know if that makes so much sense, but you'll see what I mean when I work with it. Alright, so damage outline. We definitely want that in there. Fine detail. We definitely want to retain the highlights on that. Let's go to our window. We definitely want to have the ends of my window highlighted. See? Top panel. We definitely want all the ends. Bottom wall. We want the ends of my bottom wall to be popping. Let's see. Right wall. Let's bring in the ends on those. And front wall is going to be the kicker, the outs, and the ends. So right now I just have all of my detail displayed right here. And basically what I'm going to do with this now is I'm going to collapse this whole mask copy, and that way I can select just the damage and all the insets and extrusions, all that stuff, so I can go into my specular map and start deleting the things I don't want. Alright, so I need to do an inverse selection. Select coloring inverse, and let's see what happens when I delete this now. Alright, let's keep in some of the detail. Keep some of the detail and keep some of it out. I like breaking up my specular maps with different colors. It really adds a nice, variation here. So, we'll have this panel a little bit yellow. The edges of my damage will be a little bit yellow. And some of the bigger details here, maybe they're made out of a different material than that. So we'll just leave those white. And we're adding a little bit of variation, like I said, to our specular map. We got to do one more step, though. We got to make sure that our damage right here isn't glowing. So we got to actually make a mask just for our damage. We'll call this damage mask. So we'll go all the way up. I'm going to delete that mask copy. We'll go all the way up to damage, damage outline or damage texture. And we'll select all the damage texture. We want to be careful not to mask out the nice outlines of my specular map for my damage. So when we go down to damage mask, let's choke up on that selection so we're not getting rid of those nice outlines. So I'm going to go to select, modify, contract, and we're going to contract by like 1 or 2 pixels. Alright, now we can go and grab our black and just do a fill, and this will ensure that no light is reflecting on my damage right here. My damage will not be shiny at all now. So let's look at my map and kind of pick out what our specular map is doing just by looking at the 2D image of it. All my edges around my normal detail are highlighted and bright. That means light's going to bounce off these edges. I have some color variation on different parts of my model here. That'll add a little bit of visual interest. And I have a mask just for my damage to make sure my damage isn't shiny. I don't want my damage to be shiny. I want it to be dark, diffuse, and look like it's really made out of soot and ash. Alright, great. So I'm going to go back up to my mask, collapse it, hit F2 so I can do my mask save. And let's see what the results are. Alright, subtle effects going on here, but we can still see them nonetheless. My utility panel is glowing a little bit yellowish, so it's making it look like it's a little bit more metallic than this one over here. The edges around my recesses are popping off, and my damage is not reflecting any light at all. So what we've done is we've kind of described the different materials that make up this wall here. Maybe the main brownish texture here is a really dull metal. Maybe it is concrete-ish. Maybe it's a little bit metal. But it's also not as shiny as my utility panels I've got going on here. So it's creating a juxtaposition of different materials, which ultimately adds to the interest of the prop. So I think we're pretty much done with our specular map. I'm happy with it. It's subtle, but it adds a lot to the actual model itself here. The next and final chapter will be, if the game so calls for it, adding some fire and glowy texture in our damaged bits, and maybe even going in and adding some glow within some of these recesses, and maybe it'll act like the wall still has like electricity going through it, and it'll add a little bit more of an oomph, or uh, a uniqueness about it that'll make it look that much better. Maybe the game engine or the game designers are like, no, this wall has been long destroyed. There's no glow from it. It's not destroyed. But think about this. You can duplicate this prop 2 times in your game environment. Have one that has the glow map, like it's still on fire. Have one that doesn't have the glow map, and you've effectively used one asset and basically made 2 different kinds of appearances for it. So even more visual variety in your level. So that's a bonus to making this next upcoming glow map. All right, I'll see you then.